Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It is good to see you this weekend. For those who were in synagogue last weekend or the weekend before, it's been pretty impressive. We read about the crossing of the Red Sea. We read about standing at Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah. And so after reading those 2 weeks of portions, we as Jews, we as human beings, tend to wait for thunder. Right? We wait for that fire and voice and trembling mountain, a moment that we never forget. And then we get to this week's Torah portion, and the Torah on the surface kind of disappoints us. Because right after the 10 Commandments, the Torah does not continue with theology or philosophy or prayer or heaven. It talks instead about what happens if your ox runs into my ox and neither of us have insurance. It talks about pits that you may fall into or forget to cover. It talks about damaged property and wages and loans and lost objects. Last week, the universe kind of shook. And this week, someone tripped over someone's negligence. And the question is why? As the Torah was being put together, the rabbis assume that nothing is done accidentally. And so there needs to be some reason that we have the juxtaposition of Yitro, the 10 Commandments, and everything that came from it, and Parashat Mishpatim, what we are going to be reading today, one of the 2 portions we're going to be reading from today. So why? Let's think about it a little bit. Marge.
So first you get the spiritual and the intellectual and the important way to be in the world, and then you get the reality of being in it.
Okay. So Marge's argument is first you get the spiritual and the intellectual and all of that of what it means to be in the world, and this week's portion we get the reality of what it means to be in the world. Okay? Anybody else?
I think what they're doing, this is now they have crossed Egypt, they've crossed over, they've gotten the big 10 commandments, and now these are like almost derivations of each of them, but more on how, not only how to live with others, but it's saying like things are going to go wrong, someone's going to fall in a pit. You know, there is going to be an accident at Albertson's parking lot.
Mm-hmm.
Every day. Yeah, like how do you figure out what to do when these things happen?
Okay.
The consequences, some have, the Talmud is amazing when it goes into this.
So I think you're right, and we've taken this even a step further with the Talmud, but what Diana said, for those who didn't hear, is that we start with sort of the archetypes, the 10 Commandments, those large ideas, and then these are sort of the day-to-day use of them. The day-to-day use of them. Because things happen in our day-to-day life, right? People get into arguments, people trip and they fall, and people forget things, and we get into accidents, as you said, in the Albertsons parking lot, and whatever else it may be. Those things happen. And if we don't have a way of dealing with that, society kind of falls apart. Society kind of falls apart. Okay. Anybody else? Please, Mark.
So also thinks of the fact that up until this moment, they've been slaves for generations. The order was put upon them, there were rules put upon them, and now they've got a sense of freedom. And as we know as parents with our kids, you need to start setting up certain orders
I like that. I like that. So what Mark said was they were slaves. And they were told every minute of every day what it is that they needed to do. And now they have freedom. And as Mark said, for all of us who are parents in here, once you start giving your children some freedom, along with that has to be some parameters. Otherwise, things fall apart, right? There has to be, people don't stay safe, right? Sure, I'm free to do whatever I want to do. But if I don't stop at that stoplight, I'm going to get hurt, somebody else is going to get hurt. That's how we keep each other safe. Am I free to run through it if I want to? Yes. There may be consequences to it, but yes, right? That's good. I like that. Neil.
This is also not in the Torah, and they're the chosen nation, and here are the chosen rules. No other society has these
Yeah.
rules and interpretations and the order that this is about. This is why you are different, how you are expected to behave.
So Neil mentioned the fact that we are the chosen people, right? But we're not chosen because we're better. We're chosen to live life a certain way. We're chosen to live by these rules, by these guidelines, by the Torah, because there's value in that. There's value to the type of society that we can build, to the type of community that we can build when we live and when we treat each other the way that we're supposed to treat each other. And that's, to some degree, what Parashat Mishpatim is all about. Now, it's true that the Ten Commandments do focus a little bit on interpersonal, right? We're not supposed to kill, we're not to murder, we're not supposed to steal, we're not supposed to covet, we're not, right? Those are interpersonal things, and it's not just about God. But at the same time, what we recognize is there's a whole area of how we treat one another that is left open from those 10 commandments. And Parashat Mishpatim, and what I will argue with you, is almost the entirety of the rest of the Torah, with the exception of the sections in like Leviticus that talk about the sacrificial rite and things like that. The rest of it is about how do we live together in a society? How do we respect one another? How do we treat one another in a way that not only is meaningful, but in a way that builds the type of society that we want to build? It's an important thing to think about in any day and age. We look outside and we say, well, what does society look like? Does it reflect the type of society that we want to live in? It starts, for us, with these sorts of things. And the rabbis make a very powerful statement from what seems to be an almost insignificant letter, right? If we look at the beginning of this week's portion, which you can find, by the way, on page 456 in the larger of the red books that are in front of you, it says, Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. These are the rules that you will set before them. He's speaking to Moses. And then it goes off and it's going to, all sorts of different rules, right? Even, by the way, rules that are challenging for us in the 21st century, right? It says, when you acquire a Hebrew slave, that's a bit challenging. But the rabbis notice the very first letter. What's the very first letter in the Hebrew? A vav. What does a vav mean in Hebrew? And, right? And. And. And the rabbis say, what's the and doing there at the beginning of a portion? If it's the beginning of the portion, it should just say, these are the rules. And by the way, that's how they translate it into the English. They lose that and that's there. And Rashi, one of our greatest commentators, comments on this and says the and is there. He says, Ma harishonim misinai af elu misinai. In the same way that last week's portion, those 10 commandments came from Mount Sinai, i.e. from God, so too do these commandments come from God. This is not just a nice way to live. This is not just a, we got to come up with some way so we don't, run into each other on the streets. This is a divine commandment of how it is we are expected to treat one another, of how we're expected to deal with one another as human beings. And so that goring ox and the pit and all those things that we talk about in this week's Parsha have the weight of Sinai that come along with them as well. And Musar, the part of Judaism that deals with our spirituality, returns to this point again and again and again. Rabbi Israel Salinger said, one person's spirituality is another person's material well-being. We love, especially in the modern world, to separate our spiritual life from our everyday life. Those are two very different things for us. During the week, we go to work, we do all the things we need to do, and then we come to synagogue on Shabbat, and we spend that spiritual time together to nourish, to grow spiritually, and that's wonderful. But there almost develops this separation between the two, between how I live my everyday life and how I ultimately live my spiritual life. And this parsha starts to say we need to bring those together, because how we live our everyday life is a spiritual exercise. It is a spiritual exercise. Rabbi Eliyahu Dressler writes, a person's true level is determined in the small matters. How do you tell who a person is? How do you tell the type of person that you're dealing with? Watch them in how they act when they don't think they're being watched, and how they deal with their everyday business, how they think about the world when nobody else is watching. And you'll start to understand the type of person that person is. Not during a crisis when everything is ramped up, not during, an inspirational moment when people are focused on those sorts of things, but just on your Tuesday afternoon. What does that look like? How are we acting? How are we treating one another? So why does the Torah go from revelation to damages? Because ultimately, ecstasy is easy, consistency is hard. Think about that for a moment. Anyone can feel spiritual for a moment. But how do we feel spiritual in our everyday life? How do we feel spiritual on your average Tuesday? Parashat Mishpatim is telling us it's the way in which we live our lives. It's the way in which we treat one another. When we remember that we are connected to God and there is no time when nobody is watching, perhaps we act a little bit differently. We often wait for those big moments to become better people. We say, okay, well, when I have this big opportunity, then I'm going to make the right choice. But the Torah has already told us the truth. Revelation is not just in those dramatic experiences, it's in our everyday life, in ordinary reactions. Look for it. Look for it every day. Look for it in the emails that you're about to send and how you're phrasing it. Look for it in the bills that you're about to pay. Look for it in the apology that you could avoid but really should make. In the inconvenience that you could ignore but really should dive into and make sure that it's a part of your life. The greatest spiritual achievement is not, we learn in this week's Parsha, climbing the mountain, but it's ultimately bringing the mountain down into everyday life. And every small act that we do whispers the same word that we heard in the thunder, Ani Adonai, I am the Lord your God. When we hear that echoing in our everyday life, we can ultimately build the world and the society and ourselves into the types of people that we want to be. Shabbat Shalom.